How do we make sure we don't run out of this? And then from the supply chain side, hey, we're running out of this because we're always ordering this par level, but y'all are actually using twice as much. How come your charting doesn't line up with what you're actually using? In a less aggressive question, of course, but still, like those conversations that say, here's the information and the data that we need, but we're not getting. And from the clinical side, what can we do to make sure you get the information that you need? That kind of conversation, I think, is where it starts.
Without supplies, there's no surgery. Without products, there's no patient care. Welcome to Power Supply, the healthcare supply chain podcast focused on helping you navigate the intricacies of logistics, purchasing, contracting, and supplier relationships. Each episode, we speak with healthcare executives, supply chain leaders, and innovative entrepreneurs from across the country as they share their stories, experience, and expertise on the industry we love. From the loading dock to strategic sourcing, from buyers to the C-suite, and across the enterprise, we tackle the real-life issues impacting the healthcare supply chain. Whether you're tuning in for conversation or inspiration, we're glad you're here. You're just in time to hear it from the source and stock up on insight. So sit back and plug into Power Supply.
On this episode of Power Supply, we speak with Melanie Perry. She is the host of the First Case podcast. It's one of the podcasts that I originally hosted and helped start here on our network. Our flagship brand was actually Beyond Clean, which is for sterile processing. I hosted that for a number of years, and now it's hosted by my co-founder of Healthcare HQ Media, Hank Balge. Then a few years later, we had a lot of people saying, how come you're not, really reaching out to the nurses in the operating room? I know they're listening to the Beyond Clean podcast, but you don't really have tailored content for that. So then we launched First Case, and the natural progression about 3 months later, Gary, you and Hayes and I got together and we started putting together the Power Supply podcast. And the idea behind this is exactly what today's episode is all about, which is overlap and mutual understanding of different departments and how we can work together collaboratively. It also doesn't hurt that this week is Perioperative Nurses Week. So what better time to have Melanie join us today to talk about all things, well, mostly operating room, but perioperative.
Justin, I don't have a lot to add because I think you said it extremely well. The only thing I'm going to say is I'm not going to Hayes because he's not here. So I'm going to be very proactive and professional today with Melanie because Melanie is a professional. So I'm just excited. And once again,
that's hilarious, Gary. You missed like 3/4 of a season. Hayes took some shots at you. And now here we are. We're like teeing up this episode. And this is the second one I think we've done without Hayes. And you're trying to get your revenge. This little comedic dynamic we have is just part of the magic of Power Supply.
Got to have some good times, man. Got to enjoy it. Can't be too mundane or dry in the old supply chain world. So I'm going to keep a professional perspective and toe the high line here with Hayes. So there we go. We miss him.
Well, hopefully a few people get on their soapbox in today's interview. We're going to be right back with Melanie Perry after a short break.
I'm Hayes Walter.
This is Gary Skinner.
And I'm Justin Poulin.
From the studios of Healthcare HQ, you're listening to Power Supply.
Joining us now is Melanie Perry. She is the host of the First Case podcast. And for those of you who don't know, Power Supply is one of a family of social media brands and podcasts underneath the Healthcare HQ Media umbrella. Melanie's been doing this just about as long as Power Supply. I think we probably had a 3 or 4 month head start when we got
It wasn't much. Yeah, like maybe
the team at First Case has changed, right? I'm no longer co-hosting with you, and Paul Wafer, who helped us kick it off, is now retired, and you've done such a nice job with the First Case brand, Melanie. So I'll tee this up a little bit further in a minute, but I just wanted to welcome you I can't remember. I know Gary's been on the First Case podcast, but this is your first time on Power Supply, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
Awesome.
Well, welcome.
Yeah, nice to be here on the other side of the mic, I guess.
Glad to have a nurse in the room.
Yeah. You might not be so glad if I get angry, but I mean, that's how it works,
That's
right?
what we take every day. We take that every day, Melanie. That's fine.
That's why I said
part
it.
of the mission of our patients. You're supposed to fight for them, so let's go.
But keep that positive spin there. I like that, Gary.
Melanie, that's great. Like, you literally teed off the supply chain podcast with the old norms in tension between clinicians and supply chain professionals. That was phenomenal.
I'm glad I could just, keep it on track here.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, Melanie, part of the reason that I wanted to get you on the podcast first is we've been trying to do a lot more collaboration between, the different brands. And I think ultimately, like, the Healthcare HQ concept was to start breaking down some of these silos and having shared stakeholder conversations and bringing different perspectives, to the table. And you actually recently, we talked about this with Susie Collins because she helped us kick this season off a few weeks ago. And you had reached out to her when the IV solution shortage came about after the hurricane hit. And you really wanted to do kind of a collaborative effort on LinkedIn Live. And the two of you kind of tackled that conversation together. And I think since then, we've also talked a little bit about just how I think clinicians and OR nurses like yourself are really taking a greater interest in supply chain considerations. And we've talked about it before, just the pandemic kind of changed a lot of that, back orders escalating to new high levels, although I think we've stabilized better recently. But all of those things created an awareness of supply chain for clinicians more than maybe in the past. But I also feel like you've taken some interest in that. And I think there's benefit in having that conversation with you today for the supply chain audience, because they may have, especially if they've been in the industry for a while, may have some assumptions about how much clinicians care about the supply chain. And that seems to be evolving. And I'd like to stay a little bit ahead of that curve, especially hearing from somebody who's still hands-on in the operating room every single week. So maybe you can just tell everybody about your background, and then we'll walk into, why supply chain is becoming more and more, a conversation for you on a regular basis, or at least, not an afterthought or something that happens behind the scenes.
Yeah, absolutely. I am, as you say, I'm Melanie Perry. I am an OR nurse. I work in the OR 1 to 2 days a week. And then in some other parts of my time, I won't say the rest of it, but some other parts of my time, I am working with First Case. I host our educational podcast, and I travel and speak and educate on issues that are all, important and relevant to perioperative nursing. And I like to stay, I feel like I like to stay kind of at the forefront of just what's going on in the OR world and what's affecting us and how are we being affected by it and what can we do to be prepared and be ready. Because I think a lot of us after the pandemic have this, like, maybe some have more, some have less, but like this residual PTSD of just like, okay, what are we going to have? What are we not going to have? Do we have what we need? Can we do our jobs? And so some of that, I think, drives my interest and my awareness of the interconnectedness between the clinician and the wonderful folks in supply chain and the relationship that we need to have so that we can work together to provide what we need for our patients.
Melanie, you bring up a really good point. I dislike bringing up the post-pandemic discussion, but it's changed how inventory works. And when I think about what you do, and I think about the trust that's all been built where nurses a lot of times used to count supplies. And I think still they do count some supplies. And like, we want to own it because it's supporting directly our doctors and our patients in the OR. It's a giant deal. But a lot of times, like, supply chain wants to own that trust and be our inventory specialist, whatever that title is, whatever that looks like. And you build that trust to say, Melanie, I got you. I'll take care of you. I'll make sure we got the min-max levels, inventory controls are right. And I think it's been difficult. All that trust that was built up now, especially with like IV fluids and everything that's come into play, and then you're running these issues, it's like, we got to own it because it's right to the patients and the doctor. How do you maintain that trust and that relationship with supply chain inventory management to make sure you're getting what you need? Like, you're on the forefront. I want to be on the forefront. We all want to be on the forefront, but how do you maintain that politically to make sure it's moving in the right direction?
That is a good question. In my own experience, yes, points for you, Gary. Excellent question.
Thank you, Melanie.
I think that the fundamental way that we maintain those relationships is by actually having them. And I know that sounds really basic, but you have to know your supply chain counterparts. You have to know who they are. You have to have a relationship with them. You have to be able to communicate with them, and not just the frazzled, harried nurse that comes running into central supply screaming at them because they don't have what they need. But like on a calm day, on a day when things are fine, hey, let's talk. Let's open up these lines of communication. Here's where I'm struggling. Here's what I see on the shelf, or here's what we're running out of. How do we make sure we don't run out of this? And then from the supply chain side, hey, we're running out of this because we're always ordering this par level, but y'all are actually using twice as much. How come your charting doesn't line up with what you're actually using? In a less aggressive question, of course, but still, like those conversations that say, here's the information and the data that we need, but we're not getting. And from the clinical side, what can we do to make sure you get the information that you need? You know, that kind of conversation, I think, is where it starts.
It's a big deal. And I have just that follow-up, like how you change practice on a shortage issue. Like you're clinically trained as a nurse, and all of a sudden you're not hanging a giant bag. You're changing, you're doing different things, and all of a sudden your inventory levels skyrocket. If we don't have that communication, man, that's just a downstream domino effect of failure in inventory management and taking care and price points. So, I mean, you've changed. I mean, the practice on everything that came out from the IV fluids, we're changing clinical practice. You got to communicate that, right, too?
Yeah, you do have to communicate it. And it's also, you have to recognize that as a clinician, seeing an empty shelf is scary. We don't want to see an empty shelf. When pharmacy rolls into the OR and only gives me 6 bags of IV fluids and I've got double those number of patients on the schedule for the day, like, hold up. What are we doing? How are we going to do this? And thinking about all of the different uses, you know, because we're talking about IV fluids, but all of the different ways that we use irrigation fluids and sterile fluids and all of those things. So having to think through, okay, how can we apportion this correctly? How can we do it the best? What else can we do to manage our patients' hydration levels and whatnot? But there's a lot going into it. So as the supply chain professional who just comes in and is like, well, this is all we have. Then the nurse on the other side is like, but I've got this many patients. They all need this, and we can't do surgery if we don't have X, Y, and Z. And how am I going to do that without this? That might be some of the tension that's coming out of their voice when they answer you and say, but I need more.
Yep. It's so true. And Justin, I'm sorry I'm asking so many questions. You got to jump in here.
No, Gary, you're on a really great train of thought here. I'm going to let you roll. I've got one that I can take us
and
down
if I take it too far down the right or the left, just let me know.
Keep rolling for a little bit here, Gary. You're doing great.
Melanie, you keep bringing up in my mind the forefront of just trying to foresee the future, trying to think what's happening. I mean, these conversations are like, you brought it, like electrolytes. We ask the question to support your patients on the other end in the food nutrition world. Are we going through too much electrolytes? Is there going to be a shortage in electrolytes? You got to ask those questions down the road.
Yeah.
You got to ask your vendors and your GPO affiliates. You got to ask them, where are we at? What's the contract look like? What's the agreement like? There's so much downstream effect in supply chain. And it comes right back to that point. You do not want to see an empty shelf. And if you have pivoted on your clinical practice to take care of the mission and the patients and your docs and the nurses and your staff, you got to make sure you're on board to make sure you can support that down the road. So I'm on the same page. You got me all fired up. I'll jump off my stump speech and I'll let Justin kind of dive in, or Melanie, your comments to that. So.
Oh, absolutely. Go ahead. What's up, Justin? What are you thinking about?
Well, so here's the one that comes up a lot, and it's becoming more and more a hot topic because I feel like there are solutions out there to help manage it. We actually worked with the Power Supply Advisory Group recently to develop a resource, and we're starting to release not only that resource, but also some accompanying articles to talk about bill-only PO. And I'm not sure you even know what that is, and so that's where I want to start. Do you know what a bill-only PO is?
I don't. Why don't you enlighten me?
Okay, so the reason I ask you that is because I know that you're an ortho nurse, right? And so you love ortho. So, that's where we're going to run into the bill-only POs. So it's essentially when the ortho rep is going to bring in something that the doc is going to use that day, but it's not necessarily something that they pre-order or is stocked and then picked for the case. And so you actually use it before you're aware that
and then you
going
get
to
the
be
bill
in the
later that we used
inventory
it
for the case, right?
Yeah.
And so for supply chain, this is kind of an out of order sequencing, because typically what they're going to do is they're going to, kind of know what they need to order ahead of time. It's going to be in inventory. They're placing the order, then they're stocking it. But in this case, it's sort of like you've used it and then the vendor is submitting a bill for it. And there's this verification process that is sort of after they've been invoiced, where they are going back to the clinicians to say, hey, did you actually use this product before we pay for it? And then there's also some other considerations like, are we actually being charged our contracted price for that?
Right. That was my next question. Is it approved to be used here? Can we use this product here? Are we paying too much for it with all of our different purchasing agreements? Like, those are legitimate questions that come into play if you surprise your supply chain with a product they weren't prepared for. And I have learned that from, as the team leader for orthopedics, I was the one that saw all of this stuff coming through and like, hey, yes, we used it. I promise we did. But they were verifying our implant labels and our documentation to make sure. And then I caught some heat more than once because we used something that was not on our, agreement list or whatever. And so it does cause some problems on the back end, or at least some confusion sometimes, some conversations about.
So you're familiar with the bill only PO process. You just weren't familiar with the term.
Yeah.
So like, here's kind of my follow-up question to that is like, from your perspective, what are some of the challenges too for that? Because you've got to verify that it was used in the case, but how do you get that capture? Like, I think there's pain points for multiple parties on this, right? And to your point, you're going to kind of trust that supply chain is going to know like the contract pricing and handle that part. It's still a challenge for them, but from a clinician's perspective, you're not going to worry about that. You're going to let them worry about that and et cetera. But there is this documentation side of it, when it comes to charge capture related to whatever's being used. And there are some technologies out there, and there are, some that are built in with, I want to say, different, not ERPs, but I'm blanking, but it's baked in to some solutions, and in others, it's kind of a bolt-on solution from a third party. And a lot of it can be very paper-based and manual. So from your perspective, like that, I mean, first off, being a nurse myself, I totally know that what the bane of our existence is documentation. Like, we got to document everything, and it seems excessive, and we really want to focus on patient care. And so then you have a process like this, which might be really hard for you to track down documentation wise. So I would just love to hear your perspective on, the struggles, and maybe you're not involved on that billing side and verifying that it was used, but any insight that you have would be interesting.
So on the clinician side of it all, I will tell you right now that there are probably very few clinicians who, once we're in the case and the rep has brought an item, we're just using what was posted, what the surgeon asked for. They brought it in. It's not expired. It's good. Let's go. Unless we have heard from management or leadership or somebody who was looking ahead at the case that knew there was this one-off item or something that we were going to be using extra, unless they told us, hey, some different product is coming in. A lot of just your frontline staff, the rep brought it in, I'm going to use it, and then I'm going to document that I used it. In my role as team leader, I was sometimes the one catching some of those one-offs, some of those odd pieces of equipment or implants or things that we would use. And I was making sure, oh, hey, Dr. Smith posted a case with this particular graft. We don't have that. That's something that has to come in extra. Are we good? Are we going to have it? And then is it approved to use? But your frontline staff person, they just know they need it and they've got it. And then I think the majority of our staff do understand the importance of those implants and charges like that are coming from our reps, how important it is that they document it, because your rep is going to be turning in their own charge sheet to supply chain typically. And then our supply chain or business office or somebody's going to go back and compare the nurse's charting to that implant sheet that we got from the rep to make sure that everything matches up and everything jives. And then when it doesn't, they give us a phone call and be like, hey, they have this sticker on there that they used and you don't have it. Who's wrong? And so then you have to go back and, make sure the charting is accurate. But I really do think all of our nurses in the room that are charting, as much as we hate the mountain of stickers and charting and paper that gets shoved at us during those busy cases with so many implants, we do understand the importance of documenting all of those implants and charges. But it gets hard because you're not only sitting there at the computer trying to get all the serial numbers and item numbers and expiration dates and all the details of all of this different stuff into your charting, but they're also asking for more laps, or it's time to count, or they need dressing material, or they need this, or the patient's going downhill, or God love them, your rep doesn't give you a dadgum thing to chart until your patient's rolling out the room. And then you have 45 things to chart at the end of the case, and then you're pissed because you still have to have a 15-minute turnover time. So it's like, there is a lot for sure. Yeah, there's a lot for sure. But I think going back to your original question, I do think our staff, if they don't necessarily understand that there might be an issue with billing on the back end for a one-off item or something, they might not understand everything that goes into that. I think they do understand the importance and the necessity of that particular charting. Even if our everyday item use charting in our EMR doesn't get done correctly, that's another story. But the actual stuff that our vendors bring in, that is typically, in my experience, been charted pretty correctly because they do understand how important it is that paperwork that we have in our charting matches what the rep turns in and that everything matches so that we can charge appropriately to our patients. Does that kind of answer your question and explain the flow?
There's a value analysis follow-up in here because one thing that you said along the way was like, approved for use. Right. And so, oftentimes that's not always, but oftentimes it's going through the value analysis process. And so value analysis is sort of like this function of supply chain, but it's typically clinical value analysis, and they're pulling in clinicians. And the whole idea is kind of like the purpose of this conversation today is to pull clinicians and supply chain together and have some established processes, et cetera, and definitely around product approval. And so I'm sort of interested, like, and you've worked in a number of different facilities, so your processes around products and them being approved for use in a procedure probably varied a little bit from one facility to another. But I'd be interested to get your take. Like, let's say a rep does bring something in for a case. How do you verify that it's approved for use? How do you verify that because a lot of times the patient's about to get on the table, right? And so I don't know that there's really great communication or verification, or maybe, verification. You're validating it's approved for use through your processes when it goes through value analysis. But when you're right there in the moment, getting ready to go into a procedure, I think verifying that it has gone through that validation process may be difficult.
It is.
How have you done that in the past, or how have you seen that done?
I was the manager of an OR in Fort Worth, Texas. And at that particular OR, I had a really good relationship with my materials management supervisor. And so when we had stuff that got posted on the schedule that was odd, that was, different, or maybe we could use the word unique, whatever you want to call it, I'd be like, hey, is it okay for us to use this? Can we use this? Is this approved or not? And then she would go and, do whatever magic they do, because I don't know what magic they do, to figure out if it was approved or not. And then she'd come back and let me know, hey, this is approved. We can use it. No, it's not approved. You need to let the surgeon know. And I hated it that it was always my job to tell the surgeon no, but whatever. Then we couldn't use it. Or it was, okay, it's approved for a one-time use, but then we're going to have to take this through the entire approval process before we can use it again to keep it on, for future use if they're going to use it again. Or they would want information from the surgeon. Do you plan on using this item more in the future, or is this just a one-time thing? Like, we had to collect a lot of data to give our materials management and
how did you collect
business office.
Just sort of curious, like
either emails or phone calls.
An email to somebody,
email, phone call, something. Or if it was a surgeon who was there, I'd go pin him down in the hall and be like, "Hey, I need some information. You need to tell me this now, or you're not going to get to use what you want to use." So there is a beauty of the OR that we're a little bit more personable when it comes to just having those interactions with our docs, because we work with them every day. And I know that sometimes things can be tense, but I do think they really do understand that there is an approval process there. You can't just always just the supply chain isn't Santa Claus and going to give you everything you want all the time, right? Like you do have to get approval and have payment for things and make sure that you're going to be reimbursed and all that other stuff. But it does require a conversation, an email, a phone call, something so that you don't just decide, me as the manager is like, oh, that's not approved. We're not using it. And then I'm just like, sorry, your case is canceled, Dr. Smith, because we don't approve that product. Like that does not win friends and influence people. It just doesn't. So like,
it also makes the CFO pretty unhappy because now you have an open block on the schedule where you're not generating revenue.
Yeah. Oh yeah. No. We're not going to cancel it. No. So like there are ways to do it and there are ways not to do it. And the best way to do it is to have that line of communication and relationship with your materials management supply chain people, and then also with your surgeons and your docs.
I'm going to let Gary go in a second, but I'm jumping ahead because there's one thing that you just said, which was you hate to be the one who has to tell the surgeon no. Is that where you're going, Gary?
I was going
Did I steal your
right
question?
up with it. Well, it's going to be a follow-up question to your follow-up question because it's in line with that 100%.
Okay, perfect. Because that really stuck out to me. It's like, I hate to tell the surgeon no. But the truth is, I think there's a piece of this where part of that is because you don't necessarily know the why behind it. You just know it's not an approved product. And you know that the surgeon is then going to say to you why.
Why? And I don't know that I can answer why.
They're going to want to fight it and they're going to want to have a dialogue about it.
Yeah.
But at that point, you feel powerless.
Yeah, but like Amy said it's not approved. You have to call her.
I don't know. Messenger. I don't know. It's just what I was told. So like,
and they don't like that. I'm wasting their time.
Yeah. I'm super curious about how you think that could be improved, because I think it makes sense to have somebody who has the relationship with the surgeon, have the discussion. But if you don't necessarily have all the information to that point, it can be very difficult.
So Justin, I am going to jump in on exactly on how you want to improve that. That's my question. So Melanie, you talked about your relationship with the materials manager in Fort Worth. How did you coach him or her up to make sure they had the valid information that you were going to share with the surgeon on a very limited time in the hallway, pinning him down to have the conversation? That's where I was going.
That's a good question. Ultimately, it was, her name was Amy. She was fantastic. And I'd be like, okay, look, they want to use this. Is it approved? Is it not? And she'd be like, yeah, no, it's not. I'm like, okay, why? I'd be like, why is it not approved? Or what are we going to do? And so I would try to think of every possible question that doc was going to ask me so that I could then find out. Now, this hospital was small enough that I could actually just bring her in tow if I had to, be like, come on, I can't explain this. We're going to talk to him and you're coming with me. And that was easier when it was something we could do in person. If it was an email and I could just send the information, she probably has already emailed me and said, we can't do this because of this. And I'd be like, hey, here's her email. She said this. And, and if it went further than that, I would have to connect them and be like, you need to talk to them, find out more information, but here's what I'm being told. And you try to do that as professionally as possible without sounding like an idiot, but half the time it makes you feel dumb and because you don't know all the answers to why. And you don't want to undermine your, what's the word I'm looking for? Not authority, that's not the word, but like your professionalism or be seen as somebody who doesn't know what they're doing, right? I really do know what I'm doing, but I don't know the answer to this question because it's kind of outside of my wheelhouse.
It's kind of integrity.
And it's just, it's always hard. And I don't want to be that person who can't answer the why.
It's just staying in your lanes, isn't it, Melanie? Like, what is your lane of success? Like, I always go back to like supply chain lanes here. You're a clinical. You went to school not to study Joint Commission regulations in facilities. You went to school to take care of patients. No, but we have to know. I know. There's so many bits and pieces like these lanes back and forth with supply chain and contracting and sourcing and making sure we're compliant with the GPO and admin fees and all these different pieces that like, how do you merge all that? So that's my question.
Well,
the lanes.
That's a great question. I have a question about lanes. Are either of y'all Seinfeld people? Did anybody watch Seinfeld at all?
Yeah, okay. I'm not sure I'll be able to know the actual
Do you remember when Kramer adopted a mile? And he decided it was roomier, instead of having 2 lanes in that mile, to have 1 lane. And so he took black paint and covered all of the white lines in the mile. And so he, turned it from 2 lanes to 1, right? So, and then, Elaine later's driving through. She's like, oh, this is roomy. This is nice. I've got extra room for this lane. But then, of course, it caused a huge traffic backup and all this mess. So the analogy is going to break down very quickly. But the point is, yes, we do have our lanes, and our lanes, absolutely, we are experts in our lanes. but we have to figure out a way to get rid of the lines in our lanes so that we can cross over, because we do have to communicate. We do have to, I have to know, at least have a working knowledge of what you guys are doing, or I cannot effectively manage my department. You as a supply chain professional need to understand the at least big picture of what the clinician's struggle is, so that when you go talk to them, you can relate to them because you understand what's driving their concern. Their concern is not just anger because the shelf is empty. It's 3 steps down the road from that. It's like, my shelf is empty, but now I can't take care of my patient. And what if there's an emergency and I don't have what I need to keep that patient alive? And then it's like that pressure and that tension and stress is what drives so much of that, maybe some disagreement and argument, when those conversations are happening.
Very pointed conversations. Let's get it done. Nothing wrong with that, Melanie.
Yeah.
Wanted and welcome, as we say in supply chain. If you can't take that heat, you got to get out, in my opinion.
It's no secret why you're a great podcast host, Melanie. I mean, anytime you can pull in a pop culture reference to make a business point, you can communicate a message to an audience that was phenomenal. And, points for Jerry Seinfeld. It's interesting. I just started, it's ironic. I've been podcasting for 20 years, but I'm not an avid podcast listener, but I have hooked on to Smartless with Jason Bateman. And, I don't know if you've heard it. Anyway,
I have not,
hilarious.
but I'll have to check it out.
Oh my God. Yeah, I've heard a little bit of it.
It's good. But the point is that I listened to the episode with Larry David this morning. So you talking about Seinfeld is incredibly, kind of relevant for me, because I was just listening to Larry David talk this morning.
Justin, I expect Melanie, when I see her at a conference, and we're both the same, she comes up and gives me the Elaine press right at the chest. I'm ready for it.
Yeah.
Like, Skinner, what's up?
Skinner.
I want it.
I was really thinking you were going to be barging into the room more like Kramer, Gary. I'm like Costanza. I mean, let's be honest. I'm definitely George Costanza. I'm balding in the back instead of the front. But other than that, I'm kind of short and a little round. And so,
I mean, I have had junior mints in a noir setting and actually dropped one in. I mean, let's just talk about it. I'm just kidding. It's a great Seinfeld.
All right. So I want to follow up real quick, because I know we're getting close on time, but I want to follow up on the lanes thing, because that's kind of a funny conversation in a way, because you're right. We need to have I think mentally our awareness needs to remove the lanes. But nurses, we're very used to wearing multiple hats and doing lots of different tasks that may or may not be in our role. And as a result of that, we also sort of control the product. And so to let somebody, and this is like a constant kind of conversation and tension, but to give up control over the inventory and hand it over to the experts, and in this case, OR materials, is all of a sudden also a little bit of it's a hard thing, especially for nurses that have been around for a while, to really let go of. To Gary's point, you're used to kind of going to the shelf and managing a lot of that, but it's not taking advantage of the clinical expertise. And now with the workforce shortages and everything else that's going on. And I mean, a consistent complaint for the last 20 years for nurses has been, we keep trying to do more with less staff, less time, less. And it's an aggravation. And it's part of the reason that led me to kind of move out of hands-on nursing, to be honest with you, was just, I really enjoyed the part about spending time with the patients. And, granted, I wound up doing a lot of psych because I liked the psychosocial aspects of delivering care. And I loved being a CNA. I absolutely loved being a CNA.
But you didn't have to chart when you were a CNA, and you weren't buried under paperwork.
That's right. And
that's
I found that actually once I became a nurse, I became further removed from the patient, which was one of the major reasons why I came into the industry. That's like what I was drawn to. And so I guess my follow-up question on it is, there's some things that I think are at internal conflict there for clinicians, because there's this one piece of I want more time with the patient. And so the more you're handling materials, the less time you're with the patient, because we're not going to get rid of the documentation side of it. The documentation piece is something you're going to have to live with, but it's all these other hats that clinicians wear that continues to suck time away and put pressure
and suck the life out of us.
Yeah. But at the same time, it's it's really hard to give up control over that inventory to OR materials for many nurses. And so I'd really like your take on that. Like how have you seen that be successful, or what are the concerns around that? And do you think it's changing as more and more pressure on the nurses' time, they're more easily relinquishing some of that control?
Well, I would have to say, I guess so in my experience, just because the last 2 places I've worked, we have a supply person for our department who orders our supplies and whatnot. And so we have our shelves stocked by supply and by other people. However, if I can just get on my soapbox for just a minute, we have supply people making sure our shelves are filled. But then when it comes to freaking inventory, they make us do the counting in the inventory. And I freaking hate inventory. I hate it. If you're going to stock my shelves, count my stuff. Like, that's just how it goes. Okay. But anyway, soapbox moved. Okay. I'm off my soapbox. But like,
I think that's a fair expectation. I'm not sure it's a fair staffing model for how supply chain is set up necessarily.
But I'm saying,
this is donated time. It's not paid time. It's for pizza, the normal pizza that everybody gets tired of, and Pepsi, and it's inventory management.
And you know how annoying it is to count suture? Yeah, I don't want to count suture. I freaking hate inventory. But I'm PRN now, so when they do inventory, I don't work that day.
I love it. I'm such a young team on this.
That's the beauty of being part-time, Melanie. You want to stay relevant, but
I want to stay relevant, but I'm not going to do stuff I don't like. I'm too old for that. But that is a lot of what clinical care has become. We don't get to do the care so much anymore that so much of us really like. We're buried under paperwork and counting suture and doing all of these other tasks. And the more you move up in leadership and nursing, the more far removed you are from patient care. And like, yes, you still understand patient safety and you understand the why behind why our staff is doing what they're doing to make sure that our patients have good surgical outcomes and safe patient care. But like, it's like the higher you go up the ladder in nursing, the more you are closely related to your materials management and supply chain and your environmental services and all these other departments, because, everything interacts with everything else. And if you don't understand that we are all an interrelated web, then you do not really understand healthcare. But still I don't know. The other thing, I guess, for me, yes, I have to chart. And what I want nurses to really understand is our charting has more value than just documenting what was done to the patient. Of course, that's important. Of course, we need to document what was done to the patient.
Yeah, more valuable than regulatory and accreditation.
Yeah, it's more valuable than regulatory. But think about it. You want to have what you want on the shelf? You need to chart what you used correctly. Because yes, maybe you're charting, maybe that patient's a Medicare patient and we get a flat fee for whatever we use no matter what. But your charting still is data that is being fed to materials management to know what we use, to know the products that we use, to keep those shelves stocked with an accurate amount of product. You want to make sure that you have peace of mind that what you want is there. You better chart correctly. But we have to have the time.
We've had this conversation a ton about, utilization doesn't always match up.
No, it doesn't.
And it's like we don't, and Susie and I had this, I think that was part of our conversation on the first episode for this season, was having, just not necessarily fully understanding the inventory for the reasons that you just described.
Right. And it's implants and charges from reps. It's like it's seen very differently, I think, than the rest of what we use for the case. And like I said, staff are very good at charting those implants and rep items and all that. And then it comes to the back end of their charting where they have to do all the stuff they use. And it's like, that's good. I'm like, no, like, do the best you can, because this is actually feeding our department and our utilization, and all of our numbers depend on this data. When that surgeon says, but I always use this, and then you look at the charting, it says, no, you don't. Well, actually he really does, but we can't say he really does because our charting doesn't match it.
That's a phenomenal point, is you're looking for ways to optimize.
Yeah.
If materials management is looking at utilization,
yeah,
and it's because you're taking something for granted that it will always be there. Well, right up until the point where it looks like you're not using it, it's going to get on a list. And then that's more work for materials, because they've got to figure out if it's really true or not.
Exactly. Gary comes, he's like, I'm not seeing this in the charting at all anymore. Nobody's using this particular item. You think we could take it off the shelf? And he gets his head bitten off because Dr. Jones uses it every single week, but he didn't know that because it's not documented.
Not seeing the movement. There's no movement on it.
Yeah.
These are non-movers when we do our annual inventory, Melanie. And we were counting and like, why is this not moving? What's going on here? Yeah.
Yeah.
It's not moving, but we're buying a ton of it.
That's we're buying a ton of it, but
it's not moving? That doesn't make any sense.
It doesn't make any
sense. There's a glitch.
Yeah. The glitch is the truth.
All right. We're at the end of time, and this was a phenomenal episode. I think it's going to be extremely well received. And these are the types of conversations that I think podcasts were made for. And Melanie, you are doing a phenomenal job with First Case. And if there's anybody out there working in value analysis, especially, they likely do have some clinical background. So they might be interested in listening to the First Case podcast. So you can find it on any of your favorite podcast apps. You can go to firstcasemedia.com. You can also find Melanie on LinkedIn and the First Case podcast on LinkedIn if you'd like to check that out as well. And for all of you supply chain professionals out there, little insight into the clinicians. You may have those relationships already today, but there may be others of you that are listening that are a little bit more removed from the clinical department on a day-to-day basis. And hopefully we shined a little bit of light on some overlap in the departments that you support, clinically that way. So Melanie, I can't thank you enough, and great job with the LinkedIn Live with Susie.
Thank you. That was fun.
Back in October, and such a pleasure to talk to you again here on Power Supply.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. This was a lot of fun. I enjoyed it.
It's been awesome, Melanie. You're great.
That was Melanie Perry, host of the First Case podcast here in our family of podcasts on Healthcare HQ Media, of which Power Supply is one. And as we said in the intro, Gary, this week is Perioperative Nurses Week. So what better time for us to have spoken with Melanie on all things clinical? And even as we're wrapping up, I'll just kind of throw it out there. Make sure, if you're listening to this episode kind of the week that it airs and you're a supply chain professional, make sure you wish all of those nurses in the operating room and procedural areas a happy Perioperative Nurses Week. We will also do our best to make sure that everybody on the First Case podcast that works in the OR is aware of Healthcare Supply Chain Week next week, as well as we all have a mutual appreciation for our roles within the respective healthcare organizations we work in, Gary.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I just applaud what you're saying, Justin. Just the relationship that Melanie alluded to between what happens in her direction and just her experience on First Case, bring it into Power Supply. And that's really looking to the forefront. I think what we took away from that is what she's seeing down the road and making sure the supply chain individuals are also on the same page of like, they're taking care of patients. We're all working together. We have the same mission, but we have lanes that intertwine. We all got to be on the same page. So I thought she explained it very, very well. And she's just a delight to have on the Power Supply podcast.
Yeah. Phenomenal. Great job, Melanie. Keep it up with First Case. And
Thank you.
Anybody out there who does have a clinical background or just interest in the perioperative space, go listen and check out First Case podcast with Melanie Perry. On behalf of Gary and Hayes, who couldn't join us today, and myself, I want to thank everybody for listening to this week's episode of Power Supply.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Power Supply. As a reminder, you can help support us by subscribing on your favorite podcast app or by downloading the smartphone app on your iPhone or Android. Simply search for Power Supply in the App Store or Google Play. The best thing about downloading the smartphone app is that you can access bonus content for certain episodes and view episodes in certain categories, like articles on the go and vendor spotlights. Are you following us on LinkedIn or Facebook yet? If you are and you love an episode or post, then let your social network know about it. Like, comment, or share our posts along with your thoughts and keep the conversation going. If you have any topics or guests that you would like to recommend for a future episode, just send us an email to info@powersupplymedia.net. We look forward to hearing from you.